You get $20. Dad, my son smirked at me, ready to inherit his mother's $250 million fortune. I quietly waited for the lawyer to read the next page. His face turned white. My name is Philip. I am 67 years old, and I let my own flesh and blood believe I was a destitute failure just to see the true depth of his greed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The tires of the taxi hissed against the wet asphalt as we pulled up to the wrought iron gates of Caroline's estate. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking my off-the-rack suit the second I stepped out of the vehicle. I walked up to the security kiosk, the heavy thud of the bass from inside the mansion echoing through the storm. A private memorial for my ex-wife and I was locked out. The two security guards stepped in front of the gate, crossing their arms to block my path. Before I could speak, the side door of the guardhouse swung open. Trevor stepped out, shielded by a massive black umbrella held by an assistant. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He looked me up and down, his lip curling into a sneer of absolute disgust. "Turn around, Dad," he said, his voice easily cutting through the sound of the rain. "You are not on the list." I wiped the cold rain from my eyes and looked at my son. "Caroline was my wife for 25 years. She is your mother. I am here to pay my respects." Trevor laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "My mother left you behind 15 years ago. You are a washed-up mechanic living in a crumbling shack. This is a gathering for her corporate partners, investors, and actual family. I will not have you wandering around smelling like motor oil and embarrassing me in front of the people who matter. Get back in your cab before I have you arrested for trespassing." He nodded to the guards, turning his back on me as if I were nothing more than a stray dog. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I reached into the inner pocket of my soaked jacket and pulled out a heavy black bordered access card. It bore the golden crest of Caroline's personal estate. I pressed it against the scanner on the gate. The light flashed green, and the heavy iron doors slowly swung open. The guards hesitated, looking at the screen in confusion, then stepped aside. Trevor spun around, his arrogant smile vanishing instantly. "How did you get that?" he demanded, his voice rising in sudden panic. "Caroline signed it for me 3 days before she passed," I replied evenly, walking past him without breaking my stride. I left him standing in the rain, his face flushed with a fury he could not unleash in front of the hired help. The warmth of the grand foyer hit me as I pushed through the heavy oak doors, but the atmosphere inside was colder than the storm outside. I had barely taken 2 steps when Monica intercepted me. My daughter-in-law wore a designer black dress that clung tightly to her frame, a champagne flute balanced delicately in her hand. Her eyes swept over my dripping clothes with poorly concealed revulsion. "Philip," she hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me behind a marble pillar out of sight of the main ballroom. "What are you doing here? You are ruining the aesthetic of the evening. Look at you. You are dripping on a Persian rug that is worth more than your entire life." I pulled my arm away from her grip. "I am here to say goodbye to Caroline, Monica." Monica scoffed, taking a sip of her champagne. "Caroline is gone. Tomorrow morning, Trevor inherits the tech logistics empire. $250 million, Philip. We are taking the company public by the end of the year. And just so you know, our first order of business is liquidating the useless assets. That includes the plot of dirt your pathetic little house sits on. Caroline's estate owns that land, and we are demolishing it next month to build a tennis court. You have 30 days to pack your garbage and find a cheap apartment." I looked at her, letting the silence stretch. I did not tell her that Caroline and I had built the initial logistics algorithm together in my cramped garage 30 years ago. I did not tell her that our divorce 15 years ago was a carefully orchestrated legal maneuver to shield the company's assets from a hostile corporate lawsuit. I did not tell her that Caroline and I had remained secret confidants, speaking on the phone every single Sunday until her lungs gave out. Monica thought I was a discarded relic. I let her keep believing it. Do not just stand there staring at me like a fool, Monica snapped, her patience fraying. The catering staff is in the kitchen. Go wait in there with the rest of the help until the investors leave. I will not have Trevor humiliated by his deadbeat father on the eve of his succession. I nodded slowly. I will go to the kitchen, I said, turning away from her. I made my way down the long, dimly lit corridor leading to the service entrance. The distant chatter of the wealthy elite faded behind me. Suddenly, a heavy hand grabbed my shoulder and slammed me hard against the wood-paneled wall. The breath rushed out of my lungs. Trevor stood over me, his eyes wide and frantic, the smell of expensive scotch heavy on his breath. You think you are clever forcing your way in here, he growled, pressing his forearm against my collarbone. You think because my mother felt sorry enough to give you a pass card, you have some stake in this family. I looked calmly into the eyes of the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. You are hurting me, Trevor. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. I am going to do a lot more than hurt you, old man. You think I am just going to kick you out of your house. You think I am going to let you wander around town telling people you are the father of a billionaire. I paid a visit to a private clinic in the city last week. I made a very generous donation. And in exchange, a doctor signed a preliminary evaluation stating you are showing severe aggressive signs of early dementia. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. I stared at him, processing the sheer malice of his words. Tomorrow, after the will reading. Trevor continued, a cruel smile spreading across his face. I am taking a fraction of my $250 million and filing for a forced medical conservatorship. I am going to have you locked in a state-run psychiatric facility, the kind of place where they drug you so heavily you forget your own name. You are going to rot in a white room, and I will have total legal control over every breath you take. You will be silenced permanently. He released his grip, shoving me back against the wall. Now get out the back door and walk home in the rain. Enjoy your last night of freedom, Dad. Trevor turned on his heel and walked back toward the music and the lights. I did not shout after him. I did not beg. I stood in the quiet corridor, absorbing the absolute depth of the betrayal. My own son was not merely greedy. He was a predator willing to destroy my mind and steal my freedom to protect his image. I straightened my jacket, walked out the service door into the freezing storm, and began the long walk home. I had less than 12 hours until the will reading. I needed to reach my floor, safe, secure my counter documents, and completely dismantle Trevor's life before he could file that conservatorship. The silence of the night was not a surrender. It was the calm before the reckoning. The rain lashed against the windows of the taxi as I left the sprawling gates of Carolyn Estate behind me. The heavy rhythm of the storm matched the beating of my heart. I sat in the back seat, staring at the water rushing down the glass. The fabric of my suit was soaked through and cold against my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was entirely consumed by the physical weight of Trevor pressing me against that marble wall. The threat of a forced medical conservatorship was not the idle boasting of an angry son. It was a calculated legal execution. Trevor had bribed a clinic to fabricate a dementia diagnosis. He planned to lock me in a state facility tomorrow afternoon, the moment the $250 million inheritance cleared into his accounts. He wanted to silence me permanently so he could claim the logistics empire Caroline and I had built from nothing. I knew I had a very narrow window of time to stop him. The taxi pulled into my modest neighborhood. The streetlights flickered in the downpour, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. I paid the driver with a damp bill and stepped out into the freezing storm. The small single-story house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, exactly as I had left it. At least that was how it appeared from the street. But as I walked up the cracked concrete driveway, my instincts flared. 30 years of analyzing logistics algorithms and mechanical systems had trained me to notice anomalies. The porch light was off. I always left the porch light on when I went out in the evening. I stepped onto the wooden deck, and the immediate reality of my situation hit me. The heavy wooden front door was slightly ajar. Splinters of pine littered the welcome mat, scattered like broken teeth. The brass deadbolt hung loosely from the frame, completely sheared off by brute force. My pulse steadied into a cold rhythm. I did not call out. I did not rush inside blindly. I pushed the door open with my foot, letting it swing silently on its hinges. The interior of my home was draped in shadows. I stepped inside and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The silence was absolute. If someone was still inside, they were holding their breath. I moved through the living room with slow, deliberate steps. I noticed instantly that the television was still mounted on the wall. My laptop was sitting untouched on the coffee table. A jar containing $200 in emergency cash was resting exactly where I kept it on the kitchen counter. A random burglar would have swept all of those items into a bag within 60 seconds, but nothing of obvious monetary value had been disturbed. This was not a robbery of opportunity. This was a targeted strike. I walked down the narrow hallway toward my small home office. The faint, acrid smell of burnt metal and ozone hung heavy in the damp air. It was a smell I knew intimately from decades of working in the machine shop. Someone had been running a high-speed industrial drill. I pushed open the office door and turned on the overhead light. The small room was in absolute disarray, but the destruction was entirely focused on one specific area. The woven rug that usually covered the center of the floor had been violently tossed into the corner. The oak floorboards beneath it had been pried up and splintered into pieces with a crowbar. Exposed in the subfloor was my heavy steel hidden safe. I dropped to my knees on the cold wood. The thick steel door of the safe was ruined. 3 precise holes had been bored directly through the locking mechanism using a commercial-grade cobalt drill bit. The metal was still warm to the touch. Whoever did this was a professional who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to retrieve it. I grabbed the heavy handle and pulled. The ruined door groaned and swung open. The safe was completely empty. My breathing slowed as I stared into the dark void of the steel box. The original corporate charter was gone. The joint survivorship trust documents bearing Caroline's signature were gone. All the physical proof of my ownership over the tech logistics empire had been surgically removed from my home. Everything I needed to legally block Trevor from stealing the company at tomorrow morning, while reading, had vanished. The sheer scale of the betrayal crystallized in my mind. Trevor had not just cornered me in the hallway of his mother memorial service to insult me. He had used the confrontation as a distraction. He knew I would attend the memorial. He knew I would be away from the house for hours. While I was standing in that opulent foyer, listening to his wife Monica mock my clothing, and listening to my son threaten me with a psychiatric ward, his hired professionals were tearing my home apart. He had orchestrated the entire evening to keep me occupied while he disarmed my only legal defense. I remained on my knees staring at the empty metal box. I did not scream. I did not slam my fists against the floorboards in a blind rage. Anger is a useless emotion when you are standing on a battlefield. Trevor believed that by stealing the physical documents he had won the war. He believed I was just a tired old mechanic who would simply give up and wait for the men in white coats to come and drag me to an asylum. He completely underestimated the depth of my patience and the absolute clarity of my focus. I stood up and brushed the sawdust from my trousers. The original documents were gone, but my attorney Campbell had secured digital backups on a private encrypted server 15 years ago when Caroline and I first finalized the trust. I needed to reach Campbell immediately. I needed to trigger the emergency injunction before the sun came up and before Trevor could walk into the boardroom tomorrow and claim the empire. The rain continued to hammer against the roof of the house. The cold wind blew through the splintered front door, echoing down the hallway. My home was completely compromised. I could not stay here tonight. I needed to secure the property and get straight to the financial district where Campbell kept his offices. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers moved swiftly across the glowing screen. I needed to hire an emergency locksmith to board up the front door. Then I needed to request an immediate transport to the city center. I opened my banking application to verify my available checking balance, so I could cover the premium after-hours fees for the repairs and the ride. The application loaded, and the blue circle spun on the screen for a moment, before displaying my accounts. I stared at the numbers glowing in the palm of my hand. The quiet calm I had maintained since discovering the safe suddenly shattered. I tapped the screen again to refresh the data, certain that the system was malfunctioning. The screen refreshed, but the numbers remained exactly the same. The balance in my primary checking account was 0. The balance in my emergency savings account was 0. Every single dollar I had earned over the last 40 years had been completely wiped out. I clicked on the transaction history to understand where the funds had gone. A single red notification banner popped up across the top of the screen. The text indicated that a temporary medical conservatorship hold had been initiated by a designated family proxy. All assets were frozen and transferred pending a state psychiatric evaluation. The trap had not just been set, it had already been sprung. Trevor had not waited for tomorrow morning. He had used the preliminary evaluation from the corrupt clinic to execute a total financial freeze tonight. He had stripped me of my home security, removed my legal documents, and completely erased my ability to pay for a simple taxi ride or a phone call to my lawyer. He had backed me into a corner with surgical precision, leaving me absolutely penniless and stranded in the middle of a freezing storm. The fight had escalated far beyond a simple dispute over inheritance. It was a fight for my sheer survival, and I had absolutely nothing left in my pockets but a dead phone and a broken front door. The cold blue light of the smartphone screen reflected in Philip's eyes as he stood in the center of his shattered home office. He tapped the banking application icon, expecting to see the modest checking balance he used for his daily expenses. The screen loaded slowly as the storm outside battered the broken front door. When the numbers finally appeared, the breath caught in his throat. The balance read $0.00. He tapped the screen again, believing the poor cellular connection had caused a glitch. The screen refreshed, but the numbers remained identical. A second later, a severe red notification banner dropped down across the top of his screen. The message read, "Temporary medical conservatorship hold initiated." Trevor had not simply threatened him in the hallway of Carolyn Estate. The boy had already filed the paperwork. Philip stared at the glowing red text, understanding the absolute ruthless precision of his son's strike. Last winter, Philip had undergone a minor routine procedure to clear a blocked artery. To satisfy hospital protocol, he had allowed Trevor to sign as his emergency medical proxy. It was a standard form, a mere formality for a man who lived alone. Trevor had weaponized that simple signature. He had taken that proxy to a corrupt private clinic and used it to freeze every single financial asset Philip possessed. The boy was not waiting for the sun to rise to steal the logistics empire. He was decapitating Philip before the battle even began. Without a single dollar to his name, Philip could not hire a locksmith to secure his ruined home. He could not hail a taxi to the financial district. He could not even purchase a hot cup of coffee to warm his freezing hands. He was entirely isolated in a shattered house while the most important deadline of his life rapidly approached. The reading of Carolyn will was scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. If Philip did not reach his attorney and block the conservatorship, Trevor would walk into that mahogany boardroom as the sole inheritor of a $250 million fortune. And Philip would be legally abducted by state order, silenced in a locked ward where his voice would hold no legal weight whatsoever. Panic is the luxury of the unprepared, and Philip refused to succumb to it. He closed the banking application and shoved the useless phone deep into his pocket. He looked around the dark, destroyed office, calculating his remaining resources. His eyes drifted down to his left hand. The gold wedding band sat heavily on his ring finger. He had not taken it off in 30 years. When he and Caroline legally dissolved their marriage 15 years ago, it was not because their love had failed. It was a calculated tactical maneuver to shield their personal assets and their budding logistics algorithm from a predatory corporate lawsuit that threatened to consume them both. The public believed they despised each other, The media reported a bitter separation. But every Sunday evening for 15 years, Caroline had called him. They had remained the closest of confidants, building the empire from the shadows. The ring was the silent proof of their enduring bond. Slipping the gold band off his finger felt like tearing away a piece of his own flesh. The metal resisted sliding over his worn knuckles, leaving a pale indentation on his skin. He held the heavy gold in his palm. Caroline would understand. She was a strategist above all else. She would know that sentimental attachments were useless if they prevented you from winning the war. He closed his fist around the ring, letting the cold metal ground him. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately to survive the night and reach his lawyer. Philip walked out of his ruined office and stepped through the splintered front doorway. The freezing rain was coming down in relentless sheets, turning the suburban streets into slick black rivers. He did not own a heavy winter coat. He wore only the damp suit he had worn to the memorial service. He pulled his collar up against the biting wind and began to walk. The nearest commercial district was 3 miles away. For a 67-year-old man, the journey was a grueling physical punishment. The icy water seeped through the thin leather of his dress shoes, soaking his socks and numbing his toes. The wind lashed against his face, making his eyes water, and his lungs burn with every cold breath. With every step he took through the storm, he thought of Trevor. His son was likely sitting in the warmth of Carolyn's opulent mansion, sipping expensive scotch and laughing with his wife Monica. They were probably toasting to their impending wealth, celebrating the permanent erasure of the washed-up mechanic they despised. They believed Philip was sitting helplessly in his destroyed home, crying over his empty bank accounts and waiting for the authorities to haul him away. They had fundamentally miscalculated the resilience of the man who had raised them. Philip did not stop. He put one foot in front of the other, his jaw locked, his mind focused entirely on the mechanics of his counterattack. The cold tried to paralyze his limbs, but his burning determination propelled him forward through the dark streets. It took him 1 hour and 45 minutes to reach the edge of the city commercial zone. The neon sign of a late-night pawn shop buzzed through the heavy curtain of rain, casting a harsh red glow on the flooded sidewalk. Philip pushed open the heavy glass door. The bell chimed loudly, cutting through the quiet hum of a small television playing in the corner. The shop smelled of old dust and desperate decisions. Guitars hung from the ceiling, and glass cases displayed forgotten watches and tarnished silver. A burly man with thick tattoos on his forearms sat behind the reinforced glass counter, eyeing Philip with a mixture of suspicion and boredom. Philip walked directly to the counter, leaving a trail of rainwater on the scuffed linoleum floor. He did not say a word. He simply opened his fist and placed the heavy gold wedding band onto the scratched surface of the glass. The pawnbroker picked up the ring with a pair of tweezers fitting a jeweler loop to his right eye. He turned the band over, inspecting the hallmark engraved on the inner curve. He let out a low whistle and looked up at Philip, taking in the soaked suit and the pale, shivering face. "This is solid 24-karat gold, buddy," the pawnbroker said, his voice gruff and dismissive. "Good weight to it, too. I can give you $150 for it." It was an insulting offer, a fraction of the ring's actual value. The pawnbroker was preying on the obvious desperation of a soaking wet elderly man who had walked in out of a storm. A younger man might have argued. A desperate man might have taken the cash and run. Philip simply stared at the man through the smudged glass. He did not plead, and he did not show a single ounce of weakness. "I need $200. Philip said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried absolutely no room for negotiation. "Not a penny less." The pawnbroker hesitated. He looked at the ring again and then back at Philip's eyes. He saw something in the old man's steady, unblinking gaze that told him this was not a standard transaction. This was a man executing a mission who would walk back out into the freezing rain and take his business elsewhere if his terms were not met. The pawnbroker sighed, opened the heavy cash register, and pulled out 10 crisp $20 bills. He slid them under the glass partition. Philip scooped the cash into his pocket. leaving the sacred symbol of his marriage behind on the counter. He turned and walked back out into the freezing storm. He stood on the edge of the flooded curb, raising his hand to flag down a passing yellow taxi. The vehicle pulled over, splashing muddy water against Philip's legs. He climbed into the back seat, shivering uncontrollably, but entirely focused on his next maneuver. The driver looked at him through the rearview mirror, taking in the soaking wet clothes and the grim expression. "Where to, buddy?" the driver asked, putting the car into gear. "Take me to the financial district," Philip commanded, pulling the damp $20 bills from his pocket. "And step on it." The taxi surged forward, cutting through the storm toward the towering glass buildings of the city. The temporary medical conservatorship had stripped him of his home and his life savings, but it had completely failed to break his spirit. Trevor thought he had severed his father's lifelines and secured a path to a $250 million fortune. Instead, he had unleashed a devastating storm that was about to hit the legal offices of Campbell and Associates. Philip leaned back against the worn leather seat, watching the city lights blur through the rain, knowing the real battle was just beginning. The taxi came to a halt in front of a towering monolith of steel and glass in the heart of the financial district. I paid the driver with the damp bills I had just acquired from the pawn shop and stepped out into the freezing deluge. The corporate headquarters of Campbell and Associates loomed above me like a fortress against the night sky. Inside the cavernous marble lobby, sharp-suited professionals moved with frantic purpose, completely insulated from the storm outside. I walked through the sliding glass doors, allowing the heavy warmth of the building to wash over me. My soaked-off-the-rack suit left a trail of rainwater across the pristine floor. The security guards at the main desk immediately stiffened. Their eyes locked onto me with clear intent to intercept what they assumed was a wandering vagrant. I did not look at them. I did not break my stride. I bypassed the visitor desk entirely and walked directly to the private executive elevator alcove reserved strictly for senior partners and elite clientele. A young guard stepped forward to block my path, opening his mouth to issue a harsh command. Before he could utter a single word, I reached out and punched a 6-digit numerical code into the brushed steel keypad on the wall. The light above the elevator instantly flared green. The heavy doors slid open in absolute silence. The guard froze and stepped back in utter confusion as I entered the cabin and the doors sealed shut behind me. That access code had not been changed in 15 years. Caroline and I had insisted on maintaining a private, unmonitored channel to our legal counsel when we first structured the corporate algorithms that built our empire. The smooth hum of the elevator carrying me to the penthouse level felt like a physical transition between two entirely different lives. The freezing rain and the shivering weakness of the man Trevor thought he had defeated were left behind in the lobby. I rolled my shoulders and straightened my damp tie. I was shedding the disguise of the helpless old mechanic. I was stepping back into the arena. The elevator doors parted to reveal the hushed, opulent corridors of the top floor. Thick carpets absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I moved past rows of glass-walled offices. Junior associates and paralegals working late into the night glanced up from their monitors. Their expressions turned to quiet shock as they watched a dripping elderly man march unhindered through their high-security sanctuary. I ignored their stares because I knew exactly where I was going. At the far end of the corridor stood a set of heavy mahogany double doors. I pushed them open without knocking. The massive corner office was dark and illuminated only by the sprawling city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Standing behind a massive desk was Campbell. His phone was pressed tightly to his ear, and his face was drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a fatal car accident. He slowly lowered the receiver as I walked into the room. He did not ask how I had bypassed his security. He did not question my soaked clothes or my sudden appearance in the middle of the night. He simply placed the phone on its cradle and let out a long, trembling breath. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman Campbell," said his voice barely rising above a whisper. It had been more than a decade since anyone had addressed me by that title. To the world and to my own son, I was simply Philip, a retired mechanic who spent his days puttering around a dusty suburban garage. When Caroline and I realized years ago that a predatory corporate lawsuit was poised to consume our newly launched logistics network, we made a calculated decision to protect the core assets. We executed a highly publicized, bitter divorce. Caroline kept the public-facing empire and the lavish lifestyle. I took the quiet, modest life, keeping my name entirely off the public ledgers to ensure the foundation of our wealth remained untouchable. But in the shadows, we remained absolute equals. Campbell was the architect of that legal fortress. He knew exactly who was standing in his office. I told him I needed the backup copies of the Joint Survivorship Trust immediately. I explained that Trevor had drilled my floor safe tonight and stolen the physical documents. I detailed how my son had initiated a fraudulent medical conservatorship using a bribed clinic and how he had already frozen my personal bank accounts. I told Campbell that Trevor thinks he has completely severed my access to the outside world and plans to walk into the reading tomorrow morning to claim the entire company as his own. I demanded the documents so I could legally block him the moment he stepped into this room. I fully expected Campbell to rush to his secure filing cabinets and produce the paperwork. Instead, he sank into his leather chair, resting his face in his trembling hands. The tension in the room shifted instantly. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Campbell was a veteran litigator who had fought ruthless corporate battles for us. I had never seen him look so utterly defeated. "We have a massive complication," Philip Campbell finally said, looking up at me with haunted eyes. He explained that he had just gotten off the phone with our offshore banking contacts. He told me that my son did not just drill my safe and freeze my checking accounts. Trevor had spent the last 3 weeks operating under the assumption that he was the sole legal heir to a $250 million estate. Campbell revealed the devastating truth that Trevor had completely leveraged the company. I stared at him, processing the words. Caroline only passed away a week ago. I demanded to know how Trevor could possibly leverage an estate that had not even cleared probate. Campbell pulled a thick file from his desk drawer and pushed it across the polished wood toward me. He explained that Trevor did not go through traditional banking channels because no legitimate bank would accept pending probate as collateral. My son had a severe gambling addiction. He had been hiding it from his wife Monica and from me for years, masking his massive losses behind his arrogant, tailored facade. He had accumulated staggering debts with an illicit underground syndicate. To keep these dangerous people from killing him, Trevor had provided them with forged preliminary estate documents. He falsely claimed he would have total liquid control of the tech firm by tomorrow afternoon once the will was read. On the strength of those forged documents, the shadow lenders had advanced him $15 million in cash to cover his immediate debts. Trevor secured that illegal loan by quietly attaching a lien against the corporate logistics network itself. The sheer audacity of my son and his blinding greed hit me like a physical blow. Trevor had not just stolen my home and attempted to steal my freedom. He had invited violent criminals into the very foundation of the empire Caroline and I had spent our lives building. He had treated our legacy as nothing more than a poker chip to save his own skin. Campbell's voice was tight with panic as he explained the ticking clock we were now facing. If the will reading proceeded tomorrow at 10 in the morning, without me legally blocking that lien, the debt would automatically attach to the corporate entity. The syndicate would essentially own a controlling stake in our secure logistics network by noon. Campbell warned me that these were highly dangerous people who did not care about probate court or legal technicalities. They only cared about extracting their money by any means necessary, including dismantling the company and putting thousands of our loyal employees out of work. I walked over to the window and looked out at the relentless storm washing over the city below. Trevor thought he had orchestrated a brilliant ascension to power. In reality, he had strapped a ticking bomb to his own chest and handed the detonator to a syndicate of ruthless predators. He had alienated the only person who could possibly save him and locked me out in the rain. I turned back to Campbell, feeling my mind shift into a state of absolute clarity. The grief over my son's betrayal was instantly replaced by the cold, tactical precision that had allowed Caroline and me to build this company from nothing. I told Campbell to bring up the back-end routing ledgers immediately. My voice was hard and steady, leaving no room for despair or hesitation. Trevor wanted to play a high-stakes financial game with my legacy and plunge this family into the criminal underworld. I decided it was time to show him exactly why I was the chairman of this company. I slid into the high-backed leather chair behind Campbell's massive mahogany desk. The large monitor cast a pale blue glow across the darkened room, illuminating the deep lines on my hands. Campbell stood in the corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching me in absolute silence. The storm continued to rage outside, hurling sheets of freezing rain against the reinforced glass. But inside the office, the air was entirely still. Campbell knew better than to interrupt me. 30 years ago, long before the corporate boardrooms, the private jets, and the billion-dollar valuations, I was the one sitting in a damp, freezing garage writing the raw code that would eventually change the world. Caroline was the charismatic visionary who charmed the investors and sold the dream, but I was the silent architect. I built the digital skeleton of our entire logistics empire, and I built it with hidden access doors that only the architect could ever find. My stiff, cold fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a fraction of a second. I closed my eyes and let muscle memory take over. I typed a rapid sequence of legacy commands that had not been executed in over a decade. The slick, modern corporate interface instantly vanished from the screen. The monitor blinked and was replaced by the stark, unpolished command line of the master terminal. I bypassed the standard security protocols, slicing through the expensive cybersecurity upgrades Trevor had installed as if they were made of wet tissue paper. Within seconds, I was completely inside the nervous system of the company. I began hunting for the $15 million lien. Trevor had moved incredibly fast to secure his illegal loan, but he was deeply arrogant and exceptionally sloppy. He operated with the blinding assumption that no one would dare audit the incoming chief executive officer on the very eve of his succession. He thought his mother was dead, and his father was a senile mechanic, incapable of understanding a spreadsheet. I pulled up the primary financial ledger. The screen immediately filled with cascading lines of complex routing data. I filtered the noise and isolated the massive $15 million injection originating from the shadow lenders. The sheer mechanics of his betrayal unfolded before my eyes. Trevor had used Caroline pending estate as the ultimate collateral. He had pledged a ghost asset that he fully expected to legally possess by tomorrow afternoon. But as I tracked the digital footprints, I realized he had not wired the money directly to the syndicate to settle his staggering debts. I narrowed my eyes, highlighting a bizarre and frantic cluster of digital transfers. Trevor was routing the capital through a complex labyrinth of dummy corporations. I traced the money as it bounced from the Cayman Islands to Cyprus, and finally to a series of shell companies registered under a familiar maiden name. It was Monica maiden name. The truth crystallized in my mind with sickening clarity. Trevor was not simply hiding his catastrophic gambling losses from his mother, board of directors, or the public. He was absolutely terrified of his own wife. Monica was a ruthless woman who measured human worth strictly by financial leverage and social power. If she knew her husband had gambled away $15 million of their future, she would have destroyed his reputation and left him before the creditors even had a chance to knock on their front door. Trevor was frantically shuffling the illegal loan through international dead zones, desperately attempting to clean the money. He needed it to look like legitimate offshore venture capital, returning to their shared accounts so he could pay off his debts without Monica ever knowing he had risked their entire kingdom. Campbell slowly walked up behind me, staring over my shoulder at the cascading data on the monitor. He let out a ragged, heavy breath. He asked me in a shaking voice if Trevor had successfully cleared the wire. I did not answer immediately. I watched the digital timestamp blinking next to the final pending transaction. The massive sum was currently sitting in an international holding queue, scheduled to clear at dawn. The moment the sun came up, the money would drop completely into Trevor clean accounts. The shadow lenders would hold an ironclad legal lien against my company, and the violent syndicate would own a controlling stake in our life work before I could even drink my morning coffee. I placed my palms flat against the cold edge of the desk. Trevor had underestimated me, but more importantly, he had fundamentally underestimated the architecture of the beast he was trying to steal. He thought he could use the global logistics network I created as a simple blindfold to hide his sins. I could have simply canceled the transfer. I could have clicked a single button, rejected the wire, and returned the funds back to the syndicate. That action would have protected the company from the lien. But it would have left Trevor with room to maneuver. It would have given him time to find another desperate angle to leverage my legacy. It would have given him the opportunity to proceed with the forced medical conservatorship and lock me in a psychiatric ward to cover his tracks. Simply stopping him was no longer a viable option. The corruption had to be ruthlessly excised from the root. I cracked my knuckles and leaned back into the keyboard. I did not reject the wire. Instead, I initiated a total structural lockdown on the specific offshore routing numbers Trevor was using. I accessed the dormant automated compliance protocols built deeply into the very foundation of the company financial software. With a dozen rapid, unrelenting keystrokes, I flagged the entire $15 million sequence under federal anti-money laundering statutes. The system responded instantly. Silent digital warning alarms triggered within the secure network. By legally tagging the transaction as suspicious international money laundering, I activated an automatic and completely irreversible freeze. The $15 million was abruptly paralyzed in the digital void between international borders. The capital could not be pushed forward into Trevor clean accounts, and it absolutely could not be pulled back by the furious shadow lenders. The money was now permanently trapped in federal limbo, untouchable by anyone until a full government audit could be conducted. I pressed the enter key one final time, sealing the lock. The command line flashed a bright, solid green, confirming the federal hold was active. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the pale light of the monitor reflecting in the darkened office. The silence in the room was absolute and profound. Campbell stared at the glowing screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. He realized exactly what I had done to my own flesh and blood. I turned my chair to face him, my voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. I told him it was done. The funds were permanently frozen. Trevor's illegal collateral was now entirely worthless. The fraudulent loan he had secured against my company was nullified, and the $15 million he owed to a syndicate of highly dangerous men had effectively evaporated into thin air. Tomorrow morning, Trevor would walk into the mahogany boardroom for the reading of the will, expecting to be crowned a king. He would sit beside Monica wearing his bespoke suit, believing he had outsmarted his mother, his father, and the entire world. He would expect to use his newfound billions to pay off the wolves circling his door and to finalize the paperwork that would lock me away in a padded cell forever. But the wolves were no longer waiting patiently for their money. By dawn, the syndicate would realize their $15 million had been federally seized. They would realize the corporate collateral was a complete ghost. They would realize Trevor had brazenly stolen from them. And when my son walked out of that boardroom, he would not be a billionaire. He would be a broken man with no money, no empire, and a massive debt he could never possibly repay. He would be walking straight into the arms of the very monsters he had tried to cheat. The trap was flawlessly set. I reached forward and powered down the terminal, plunging the executive office into complete darkness. I settled deep into the leather sofa, pulling my damp jacket around my shoulders, and closed my eyes to wait for the dawn. I stepped away from the glow of Campbell monitor, leaving the federal freeze actively locking the $15 million in a digital void. Campbell was still sitting in his heavy leather chair, staring at the screen, as if it were a live grenade. He had spent his entire career navigating corporate loopholes and drafting airtight contracts, but he had never witnessed a father systematically dismantle his own bloodline with such clinical, mechanical precision. I did not offer him a comforting word or an explanation. I simply turned my back on the terminal, and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I told Campbell to stay entirely out of the system and not to touch the keyboard under any circumstances. I needed to step out of the building for exactly 20 minutes. The air in the executive suite felt too sterile for what I had to do next. I rode the private elevator back down to the lobby in total silence. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the storm earlier had faded, leaving behind a cold, metallic resolve. I walked past the bewildered security guards and pushed through the sliding glass doors, stepping back out into the freezing deluge of the financial district. The storm had not broken. The rain was coming down in relentless driving sheets pooling in the blocked gutters and reflecting the harsh neon lights of the city. I pulled my soaked jacket tight around my shoulders and began to walk down the deserted avenue. The expensive dress shoes that Monica had mocked earlier splashed through the freezing puddles, but I barely registered the cold. My mind was entirely focused on the final moving piece of the trap. Trevor had invited a pack of starving wolves to our door. He had recklessly borrowed $15 million from an illicit underground syndicate, using my company as a fraudulent shield. He believed he was smart enough to play a high-stakes game with violent predators simply because he wore a bespoke suit and possessed a prestigious last name. He lacked the fundamental understanding that criminals do not respect corporate titles. They respect leverage, and they respect cash. Now that I had permanently paralyzed his offshore wire transfer, Trevor had absolutely nothing to offer them. He was a dead man walking, but he just did not know it yet. I could not allow those predators to discover the missing funds on their own time. They needed to know exactly who had deceived them, and they needed to be waiting for Trevor the moment his grand illusion shattered. 2 blocks away from Campbell Building, I found what I was looking for. A small 24-hour convenience store sat wedged between 2 towering banks, its fluorescent lights buzzing aggressively against the dark, wet street. I pushed the glass door open, the chime announcing my arrival. The store smelled of stale coffee and harsh chemical cleaners. A young clerk with heavy eyes looked up from his magazine, taking in my dripping suit and pale face. I walked straight to the electronic display behind the counter and pointed to the cheapest prepaid cellular phone on the rack. I pulled the damp $20 bills I had acquired from the pawn shop out of my pocket and placed them on the counter. The clerk did not ask any questions. He processed the transaction in silence and handed me the small plastic box. I did not wait inside to activate the device. I walked back out into the punishing rain, finding shelter under a dark canvas awning attached to an abandoned storefront. The wind howled through the concrete canyon of the financial district, masking the sound of tearing cardboard as I ripped the phone from its packaging. I popped the back cover off, slid the battery into place, and powered the device on. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale, cheap light across my wet hands. I waited for the cellular signal to connect. My thumb hovered over the keypad. This was the point of no return. As a father, you spend your entire life protecting your children from the consequences of their own reckless actions. You cushion their falls. You pay their debts. You endure their disrespect, hoping that one day they will mature into honorable men. But Trevor had crossed a threshold that could not be forgiven. He had weaponized the medical system to steal my freedom. He had plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward to rot in isolation. He had looked me in the eyes and promised to erase me from existence. I realized, standing there in the freezing rain, that I was no longer dealing with my son. I was dealing with a parasite that was actively trying to consume my life. The hesitation evaporated. I punched in the international routing number I had memorized from Campbell back-end ledger. The phone rang 3 times. The tone was hollow and distant, bouncing through untraceable satellites before connecting to the hidden core of the shadow lending syndicate. When the line finally clicked open, there was no polite greeting. There was only the heavy sound of breathing and the faint rhythmic thud of music in the background. A man finally spoke. His voice was thick and raspy like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. He asked who was calling on this restricted line. I did not introduce myself. I lowered my register, forcing the words through my teeth in a clipped metallic rhythm. that betrayed absolutely no emotion. I told him he was looking for a return on a $15 million investment made to a man named Trevor. I heard the man shift sharply on the other end of the line. The background music was instantly muted. The atmosphere of the call changed from casual annoyance to absolute lethal focus. He demanded to know how I had acquired his direct number and who the hell I was. I ignored his aggressive posturing. You do not negotiate with predators. You simply give them the scent of blood and step out of the way. I told him the collateral Trevor had offered the syndicate was absolute garbage. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single word penetrated the criminal arrogance on the other end of the line. I explained that the estate documents Trevor had presented were completely fraudulent. The tech logistics empire he claimed to control was not his to leverage. I let that reality hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the killing blow. I informed the man that the federal government had just flagged the transaction and placed a permanent hold on the $15 million moving through Trevor offshore shell accounts. The money was frozen in transit. It was never going to reach their pockets. The silence that stretched across the cellular connection was terrifying. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a violent entity processing a massive financial hemorrhage. The man did not shout. He did not curse or throw empty threats into the phone. His voice dropped to a cold, dead whisper. He asked me exactly where Trevor was hiding. I delivered the final pieces of the execution. I told the man that Trevor believed his illusion was still perfectly intact. I explained that Trevor was planning to attend a formal will reading tomorrow morning at exactly 10 o'clock. I gave him the precise address of Campbell Mahogany Boardroom in the financial district. I detailed the floor number and the layout of the lobby. Then I added the specific lie that would guarantee their immediate and overwhelming response. I told the man that Trevor had already chartered a private flight out of the country scheduled for noon. I said he was planning to finalize the inheritance, collect the liquid assets, and vanish across international borders, leaving the syndicate holding a worthless piece of paper. The man on the other end let out a low, dark chuckle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a sound devoid of any humanity. He told me that Trevor would not be making any flights tomorrow. He promised me that Trevor would be taking a very long permanent drive in the trunk of a car before the sun went down. The line went dead with a sharp click. I lowered the burner phone from my ear. The rain continued to pour around me, washing over the dark, empty street. I felt no joy in what I had just done. I extracted no sadistic pleasure from condemning the boy I had raised to face a cartel of violent criminals. But I also felt no regret. I felt only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a restored equation. Trevor had built his entire identity on the illusion of power, using my money, my company, and my legacy to shield himself from the real world. He thought he was untouchable. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, the real world was going to break down the doors of the boardroom and collect its due. I crushed the cheap plastic phone in the palm of my hand, feeling the screen splinter under the pressure of my grip. I broke the device into 3 jagged pieces and walked over to the edge of the curb. I dropped the shattered plastic down through the rusted iron grate of a storm drain, watching the rushing black water carry the evidence away into the subterranean darkness of the city. The trap was fully set. The federal freeze was locked in the servers, and the wolves were officially marching toward the boardroom. Trevor Fate was now entirely out of my hands. I turned away from the storm drain and began the walk back to the towering glass fortress of Campbell and Associates. I was soaking wet, freezing, and operating on 0 hours of sleep. But my posture was perfectly straight. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the lobby, bypassing the security guards once more. I entered the private elevator, pressing the 6-digit code to ascend to the penthouse. Tomorrow morning, Trevor would hand me a $20 bill and tell me I was a worthless failure. Tomorrow morning, I would look him in the eyes and watch his entire universe burn to ash. The blue glare of the monitor faded into the dark corners of the office as I stepped back from the keyboard. Campbell was already moving. He did not waste time asking questions about the syndicate or the federal freeze I had just initiated. He knew the parameters of the battlefield had shifted, and he adapted instantly. He walked over to a massive steel filing cabinet concealed behind a rich mahogany panel in the wall. The heavy metallic click of the lock turning sounded like a vault sealing shut. He pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio and carried it to his desk. The rain was still beating relentlessly against the glass windows of the penthouse. The city below was a blur of distorted lights, but inside this room, the focus was absolute. Campbell opened the portfolio and spread the thick ivory parchment pages across the polished wood. These were the final iterations of Caroline Will. The original physical copies that Trevor had so desperately tried to destroy by drilling into my floor safe were entirely irrelevant. Campbell always maintained the authenticated master files. I looked down at the crisp black ink and saw my ex-wife's signature at the bottom of the page. Seeing her handwriting sent a sharp ache through my chest, but I pushed the emotion down. Grief could wait until tomorrow. Tonight required precision. Campbell slid a silver pen across the desk toward me. He pointed to the third page of the document. He told me we needed to review the specific addendums Carolyn had insisted upon during her final visit to this office. It was a rainy afternoon, just like this one, only 3 weeks before her lungs finally gave out. She had sat in the exact chair I was standing behind. Campbell explained that Caroline had spent the last 2 years quietly observing our son. She had watched Trevor parade around the corporate offices in his bespoke suits. She had monitored his arrogant interactions with the logistics teams we had built from the ground up, and she had seen the naked, unchecked greed rotting inside him. Caroline was a brilliant strategist. She knew that the moment she died, Trevor would assume the entire $250 million empire was his birthright. She knew he would view me as a weak obstacle to be easily discarded, so she engineered a legal failsafe. Campbell tapped his index finger against a densely worded paragraph near the center of the page. He called it the primary deterrent. I leaned forward and read the legal jargon. It was a beautifully ruthless piece of corporate architecture. Caroline had structured the entire tech logistics empire into a joint survivorship trust. The public illusion of our bitter divorce had kept my name completely unassociated with the corporate entity for 15 years. Trevor believed he was inheriting a sole proprietorship. He had no idea that the company was legally bound to a co-founder. The document explicitly stated that upon the death of either partner, 100% of the assets immediately and irrevocably reverted to the surviving member. The empire did not belong to the estate. It belonged to me. But Caroline did not stop there. She knew Trevor would try to contest the survivorship trust. She knew he would drag the estate through years of agonizing probate litigation, claiming that he had been accidentally omitted from the final distribution. She anticipated his courtroom tactics and neutralized them before she even took her last breath. Campbell turned to the fourth page and pointed to a single highlighted sentence. This was the masterstroke. Caroline had explicitly included Trevor in the will. She left him a specific and undeniable inheritance. She bequeathed him exactly $20. By legally naming him and leaving him a single $20 bill, she activated an ironclad no-contest clause. Trevor could not claim he was forgotten. He could not claim mental incompetence on her part. She had acknowledged his existence and assigned a precise monetary value to his worth. If he tried to challenge the document in any court, he would automatically forfeit even the $20 and be burdened with the entirety of the legal fees. I stared at the clause, feeling a profound sense of awe for the woman I had married. Even as she was dying, Caroline was meticulously laying the groundwork to protect our legacy from the very son we had brought into the world. She knew Trevor had become a parasite. She knew he would attempt to leverage the company for his own vanity, and she had given me the exact weapon required to amputate him from our life work. "Sign the execution orders," Philip Campbell said, his voice low and steady. "Once these are countersigned and date-stamped, the trap is permanently set. There is absolutely nothing he can do to stop the transfer of power. I picked up the silver pen. The metal felt heavy and cold in my fingers. I thought about the humiliation I had endured in the foyer of the estate just hours ago. I thought about Monica looking at me with pure disgust, mocking my damp clothes, and threatening to demolish my home to build a tennis court. I thought about Trevor slamming me against the wall, his breath reeking of expensive liquor as he promised to lock me in a state-run asylum. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had secured their glittering future by crushing a defenseless old man. I pressed the pen to the parchment and signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly across the page. I signed the second order and then the third. With every stroke of the pen, I was sealing the doors of the cage Trevor had so arrogantly walked into. He had borrowed $15 million from violent shadow lenders using an empire he did not own as collateral. Now his illegal wire transfer was federally frozen, and the legitimate ownership of the company was legally cemented in my name. The illusion of his wealth was completely shattered. The syndicate would be waiting for him tomorrow, and he would have absolutely nothing to offer them but empty hands and worthless promises. Campbell took the documents, gathered them into a neat stack, and placed them back into the leather portfolio. He locked the portfolio inside the heavy steel cabinet behind the mahogany wall panel. The definitive loud click of the locking mechanism echoed through the quiet office. It was done. The legal machinery was fully armed and waiting for the morning. "You should get some rest," Mr. Chairman Campbell said quietly. He walked over to the doorway and rested his hand on the brass handle. "They will be here at 10 o'clock sharp. I will have security standing by in the lobby." I nodded slowly. "Thank you, Campbell, for everything." He offered a grim, solemn nod and stepped out of the office, pulling the heavy double doors shut behind him. I was left alone in the massive penthouse suite. The adrenaline that had fueled my march through the freezing storm and my infiltration of the corporate servers finally began to drain from my veins. An absolute crushing exhaustion settled deep into my bones. My off-the-rack suit was still damp, and my shoes were ruined, but I did not care. I walked over to the long vintage leather sofa, positioned against the far wall of the office. The leather was cool and smooth. I unbuttoned my ruined jacket and draped it over the back of a nearby chair. I lay down on the sofa, staring up at the dark ceiling. The relentless drumming of the rain against the glass provided a steady, rhythmic soundtrack to the quiet isolation of the room. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness take over. I did not feel any anxiety about the confrontation to come. I did not worry about the violent syndicate, or the federal freeze, or the look on my son's face when his world collapsed. The architecture of the trap was flawless. I pulled my knees up slightly, resting my hands on my chest. I listened to the storm waiting for the dawn to break. The silence was absolute, and tomorrow the reckoning would be swift. I lay there in the quiet dark, letting my mind drift back to the early days in the garage. The smell of solder and motor oil had been a constant companion back then. Caroline would sit on an overturned plastic crate wrapped in an oversized wool sweater, drinking black coffee while I wrestled with the rudimentary motherboards that would eventually form the backbone of our global tracking systems. We did not have a cent to our names, but we had an unbreakable unified vision. We wanted to build something enduring, something that could withstand the shifting tides of the world. We had poured our blood and our youth into those concrete floors. Trevor had never known that struggle. He was born into the era of sudden exponential wealth. He grew up walking on imported carpets and attending private academies where ambition was measured by the price tag on a watch rather than the calluses on a hand. We had tried to teach him the value of creation, the importance of building something rather than simply consuming it. But the wealth had acted as a slow-acting poison. It had insulated him from consequence and bred a terrifying sense of entitlement. He looked at the logistics empire not as a living, breathing organism maintained by thousands of hardworking employees, but as a personal piggy bank meant to fund his vanity. I shifted on the leather sofa, feeling the stiff, damp fabric of my trousers clinging to my legs. The physical discomfort was a grounding reminder of the reality I had chosen to live. I had stayed in that small house retaining my simple life because I refused to let the empire dictate my identity. Caroline had played the public role attending the galas and managing the board members, but she had never lost her edge. She had seen the poison taking hold of Trevor, and she had warned me during one of our Sunday calls. She had told me that he was borrowing heavily against his future trust distributions. She had noticed the erratic behavior, the sudden frantic need for liquidity, the desperate attempts to project an image of infinite wealth to Monica and her high society circles. We had hoped he would hit a wall and learn a hard lesson. We had hoped the pressure would force him to mature. Instead, he had doubled down, turning to the dark corners of the financial underworld to sustain his illusions. He had brought a violent shadow syndicate to the doorstep of our legacy. And when Caroline finally passed, he saw his opportunity to sweep the board clean. He viewed me as a relic, an inconvenience to be institutionalized and forgotten. The rain began to slow outside the windows, tapering off into a soft, steady drizzle. The city lights below flickered through the lingering mist. I let my breathing fall into a slow, measured rhythm. The emotional pain of recognizing my son's true nature had been cauterized hours ago in the hallway of the estate. Now, there was only the cold mechanics of cause and effect. Trevor had initiated a sequence of events designed to destroy me. I had simply rerouted that destructive energy back onto his own path. When the sun rose over the financial district, the federal authorities would already be auditing the frozen offshore accounts. The shadow lenders would be mobilizing their enforcers, realizing their $15 million was gone. And Trevor, completely oblivious to the catastrophic failure of his plans, would walk into this building, expecting to be handed the keys to the kingdom. He would sit at the mahogany table and wait for his coronation. I closed my eyes entirely, surrendering to the heavy pull of exhaustion. The trap was armed. The documents were signed. The legacy Caroline and I had built was protected behind an impenetrable wall of legal and digital armor. I let the silence of the executive office wash over me. The long night was finally ending, and I was ready for the morning. The heavy brass clock on the wall struck 10 in the morning as I pushed open the towering mahogany doors of the executive boardroom. The air inside was completely still and climate-controlled, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of freshly roasted espresso and expensive leather upholstery. I walked into the cavernous space, my footsteps muffled by the thick, hand-woven carpet. My suit was completely dry now, but the fabric was stiff and deeply wrinkled from the freezing rain I had endured the night before. I did not care how I looked. The time for appearances had ended long ago. At the far end of the sprawling, polished table sat Trevor and his wife, Monica. They were positioned at the head of the room like a king and queen awaiting a royal coronation. Trevor wore a pristine silver suit that gleamed under the recessed lighting, his hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating an overwhelming, unearned confidence. Monica sat close to him, resting her hand casually over his forearm. She wore a tailored white dress, sipping a dark espresso from a delicate porcelain cup. They both looked up as I entered the room. Trevor's face immediately split into a wide, predatory grin. He leaned back in his plush, high-backed leather executive chair, crossing his legs with deliberate slowness. He watched me walk the entire length of the massive table. He looked at my ruined shoes and my worn jacket, soaking in every detail of my apparent defeat. He truly believed he was looking at a broken, destitute old man who had spent the entire night shivering in an alleyway, crying over frozen bank accounts. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the night in the penthouse directly above him, dismantling his entire universe. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair at the absolute furthest end of the table and sat down. The physical distance between us mirrored the vast, unbridgeable emotional chasm that now separated me from the boy I had raised. I folded my hands, resting them on the cool, smooth surface of the mahogany. I did not say a word. I simply looked at him, waiting for him to reveal the full extent of his arrogance. Trevor chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. He reached down and opened the brass latch of his imported Italian leather briefcase. He pulled out a glossy trifold brochure. He tossed it onto the polished wood and shoved it hard with the palm of his hand. The glossy paper glided rapidly across the long table, spinning slightly, before coming to a stop just a few inches away from my folded hands. I looked down at the paper. The cover featured a picture of a sterile white concrete building surrounded by high chain-link fences, masked by a few strategically planted trees. It was a promotional pamphlet for a state-run psychiatric facility. It was an asylum. Trevor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and steepling his fingers together. He told me to read the brochure very carefully. He said he wanted me to get familiar with the amenities because that was exactly where I was going to be sleeping tonight. His voice was thick with smug satisfaction. He bragged that the preliminary medical evaluation he had purchased from the corrupt clinic was already sitting on a judge's desk in the city courthouse. He boasted that he had paid an exorbitant premium to expedite the filing. He promised me that by noon today, the forced medical conservatorship order would be permanently finalized and signed into law. Monica laughed softly, lowering her porcelain espresso cup onto its matching saucer. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. She told me I should be incredibly grateful to her husband. She sneered that considering my bank accounts were currently sitting at zero, it was a tremendous act of charity for Trevor to find a facility that accepted state subsidies to house me. She smiled a cruel, venomous smile, completely oblivious to the catastrophic danger hovering over her own life. She sat there, mocking my empty pockets, having absolutely no clue that her husband owed $15 million to a violent underground shadow syndicate that was actively hunting him at this very moment. I did not touch the brochure. I did not react to the insults or the threats of permanent institutionalization. I kept my eyes locked directly on my son. I watched the sheer blinding hubris radiating from his pores. Trevor truly believed he had neutralized every single threat. He believed that the $15 million fraudulent loan he had secured using his mother ghost estate as collateral had successfully cleared the offshore routing servers at dawn. He believed his massive gambling debts were effectively erased, and that he was sitting seconds away from inheriting a $250 million tech logistics empire. He thought he was untouchable. Trevor shook his head, mocking my stoic silence. He uncrossed his legs and leaned back into his chair, projecting the aura of a man who held absolute power over life and death. He looked down the length of the table, his eyes gleaming with malicious joy as he prepared to deliver the final killing blow. He spoke slowly, savoring every single syllable of the insult he had undoubtedly been practicing in the mirror all morning. "You get $20, Dad. Do not spend it all in one place." He threw his head back and laughed, a loud barking sound that filled the boardroom. He wiped a tear of mirth from his eye and shook his head. He told me his mother was not a completely heartless woman. He mocked that she had seen fit to leave a generous little tip for the useless mechanic who used to fix her cars. He gloated that the moment the lawyer arrived and formally read the preamble, the entire corporate entity would legally transfer into his name. He stated that he would become the sole sovereign director of the logistics network, and I would be permanently erased from the family legacy, treated like a bad memory, swept into a locked, padded room. I let the heavy silence stretch across the vast expanse of the boardroom. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not show a single microscopic ounce of fear, panic, or anger. I sat perfectly still, anchored by the invisible, devastating trap I had armed in the darkness of the night. I knew that the federal authorities were already crawling through his frozen offshore accounts. I knew the syndicate enforcers had realized their money was trapped in a federal void, and their corporate collateral was a complete illusion. I knew the wolves were currently marching toward this exact building. I simply stared at the man sitting at the head of the table. He was no longer my son. He was an arrogant parasite dancing blindly on the precipice of his own absolute destruction. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the room clicked open. Campbell walked in carrying the thick leather portfolio under his arm, his face pale and completely devoid of expression as he prepared to spring the trap. The heavy brass clock on the wall struck 10 in the morning as I pushed open the towering mahogany doors of the executive boardroom. The air inside the cavernous space was completely still and climate-controlled, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of freshly roasted espresso and expensive leather upholstery. I walked into the room, my footsteps entirely muffled by the thick hand-woven carpet. My suit was completely dry now after spending the night on the leather sofa in Campbell office, but the dark fabric was stiff and deeply wrinkled from the freezing rain I had endured the night before. I did not care how I looked. The time for appearances and carefully maintained illusions had ended long ago. At the far end of the sprawling, polished table sat Trevor and his wife, Monica. They were positioned at the head of the room, like a king and queen awaiting a royal coronation. Trevor wore a pristine silver suit that gleamed under the recessed lighting, his hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating an overwhelming, unearned confidence. Monica sat close to him, resting her hand casually over his forearm. She wore a tailored white dress, sipping a dark espresso from a delicate porcelain cup. They both looked up as I entered the room. Trevor's face immediately split into a wide, predatory grin. He leaned back in his plush, high-backed leather executive chair, crossing his legs with deliberate slowness. He watched me walk the entire length of the massive table. He looked at my ruined shoes and my worn jacket, soaking in every detail of my apparent defeat. He truly believed he was looking at a broken, destitute old man who had spent the entire night shivering in an alleyway, crying over frozen bank accounts. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the night in the penthouse directly above him, dismantling his entire universe line by line. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair at the absolute furthest end of the table and sat down. The physical distance between us mirrored the vast, unbridgeable emotional chasm that now separated me from the boy I had raised. I folded my hands, resting them on the cool, smooth surface of the mahogany. I did not say a word. I simply looked at him, waiting for him to reveal the full extent of his arrogance. Trevor chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. He reached down and opened the brass latch of his imported Italian leather briefcase. He pulled out a glossy trifold brochure. He tossed it onto the polished wood and shoved it hard with the palm of his hand. The glossy paper glided rapidly across the long table, spinning slightly, before coming to a stop just a few inches away from my folded hands. I looked down at the paper. The cover featured a picture of a sterile white concrete building, surrounded by high chain-link fences, masked by a few strategically planted trees. It was a promotional pamphlet for a state-run psychiatric facility. It was an asylum. Trevor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and steepling his fingers together. He told me to read the brochure very carefully. He said he wanted me to get familiar with the amenities because that was exactly where I was going to be sleeping tonight. His voice was thick with smug satisfaction. He bragged that the preliminary medical evaluation he had purchased from the corrupt clinic was already sitting on a judge's desk in the city courthouse. He boasted that he had paid an exorbitant premium to expedite the filing. He promised me that by noon today, the forced medical conservatorship order would be permanently finalized and signed into law. Monica laughed softly, lowering her porcelain espresso cup onto its matching saucer. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. She told me I should be incredibly grateful to her husband. She sneered that considering my bank accounts were currently sitting at zero, it was a tremendous act of charity for Trevor to find a facility that accepted state subsidies to house me. She smiled a cruel, venomous smile, completely oblivious to the catastrophic danger hovering over her own life. She sat there mocking my empty pockets, having absolutely no clue that her husband owed $15 million to a violent underground shadow syndicate that was actively hunting him at this very moment. I did not touch the brochure. I did not react to the insults or the threats of permanent institutionalization. I kept my eyes locked directly on my son. I watched the sheer blinding hubris radiating from his pores. Trevor truly believed he had neutralized every single threat. He believed that the $15 million fraudulent loan he had secured using his mother ghost estate as collateral had successfully cleared the offshore routing servers at dawn. He believed his massive gambling debts were effectively erased and that he was sitting seconds away from inheriting a $250 million tech logistics empire. He thought he was untouchable. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the room clicked open. Campbell walked in, carrying the thick leather portfolio under his arm, his face pale and completely devoid of expression as he prepared to spring the trap. He walked directly to the massive oak podium positioned at the side of the boardroom table. Trevor let out a loud, exasperated sigh, uncrossing his legs. He muttered that it was about time the hired help decided to show up. Campbell placed the portfolio on the podium. The metallic click of the brass clasp unlocking echoed sharply in the silent room. He opened the leather cover and ran his hand over the thick ivory parchment. He cleared his throat. The sound was dry and professional, cutting through the heavy tension of the boardroom. He began to read the preamble of the last will and testament. His voice was steady and measured, reciting the standard legal declarations, establishing that Caroline was of sound mind and body when the document was drafted. He read the clauses revoking all previous wills and codicils. Trevor tapped his fingers impatiently against the polished mahogany surface. He rolled his eyes at the formal language, silently urging the lawyer to skip the formalities and get to the distribution of the assets. He had no patience for tradition or respect for the gravity of his mother's final words. He only cared about the liquidation of her life. I watched his fingers tapping against the wood and remembered the afternoon Caroline had sat in Campbell's office and carefully engineered this very moment. She had known Trevor would be sitting exactly where he was sitting, now consumed by an insatiable hunger for capital. She had designed the architecture of her will specifically to punish that blinding greed. Campbell turned the first page. The heavy parchment made a crisp sound as it settled against the wood. He announced that he would now read the specific bequests. Trevor leaned forward slightly, a smug smile touching the corners of his mouth. He was anticipating the formal transfer of the executive voting shares. Campbell looked down at the document and read the specific provision Carolyn had drafted for our son. He stated clearly that to her only child, Trevor, she bequeathed the sum of exactly $20. The words hung in the sterile air of the boardroom. Trevor blinked, his arrogant smile freezing on his face for a fraction of a second, before breaking into a wide, cruel smirk. He let out a short, barking laugh and looked directly at me. He shook his head, leaning over to whisper something to Monica. Monica let out a soft, elegant giggle. Trevor thought it was a joke. He thought his mother was using her final legal document to deliver a petty insult to the mechanic father he so deeply despised. He thought the $20 stipulation was a symbolic gesture, mocking the cheap cash he had thrown at my feet the night before. He believed Carolyn was aligning with his cruelty from beyond the grave, playing a final practical joke before handing him the keys to the empire. He delivered his line with theatrical cruelty, telling me that I get $20 and warning me not to spend it all in one place. He did not understand the intricate legal trap that had just clamped down around his ankles. Caroline had not left him $20 as a joke. She had done it to execute a ruthless legal maneuver. By explicitly naming Trevor in the document and leaving him a precise monetary value, she had legally acknowledged his existence as an heir. She had completely eliminated his ability to claim that he was accidentally forgotten or omitted due to mental decline. And by tying that specific inheritance to the overarching structure of the will, she had activated a strict no-contest clause. If Trevor decided to challenge the document in any probate court, he would automatically forfeit the $20 and be held entirely responsible for the catastrophic legal fees generated by the dispute. He was locked in a perfect legal cage. He could not fight the will without destroying himself in the process. But sitting at the head of the table sipping his espresso, Trevor was completely oblivious to his own confinement. He waved his hand dismissively at Campbell, telling the lawyer to skip the sentimental garbage and get to the reading of the primary estate. He demanded to hear the transfer protocols for the $250 million corporate holding company. Campbell did not react to the disrespect. He simply turned the heavy ivory page. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The dry professional tone Campbell had used for the preamble vanished, replaced by the cold, hard cadence of an executioner reading a final sentence. He announced that he was now reading the primary addendum governing the totality of the estate. Trevor uncrossed his arms, resting his hands flat on the table, ready to receive his crown. Campbell began to read the terms of the corporate ownership. He stated that the entire tech logistics empire and all associated liquid assets were not held by Caroline as a sole proprietor. He read the specific legal terminology detailing the formation of a joint survivorship trust. The words seemed to hit an invisible wall in the middle of the boardroom. Trevor's brow furrowed. The smug smile began to slip from his face, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He looked at Monica, but she was staring blankly at the lawyer, clearly unable to decipher the dense financial phrasing. Trevor interrupted Campbell, demanding that the lawyer speak in plain English. He asked what a joint survivorship trust meant for his immediate transition to chief executive officer. Campbell stopped reading. He looked up from the parchment and met Trevor's eyes. The lawyer's expression was entirely devoid of pity. He explained the structure of the trust with absolute surgical precision. He told Trevor that the company had never belonged exclusively to his mother. He revealed that 30 years ago, the entire digital skeleton of the logistics network had been built in a suburban garage by a silent architect. He explained that Caroline was simply the public face of a partnership that had been legally cemented before the company ever generated its first dollar. He stated that the trust was designed so that upon the death of either founding partner, the entirety of the corporate assets immediately and irrevocably reverted to the surviving member. The company did not pass into probate. It did not become part of a distributable estate. It simply collapsed back into the hands of the sole remaining owner. Trevor's face drained of all color. The polished silver suit suddenly seemed to hang loosely on his frame. He stammered, asking who the surviving partner was. He demanded to know who his mother had secretly partnered with to build the empire. He was desperately searching for a phantom investor, a hidden board member, anyone he could bribe or intimidate. He refused to look down to the far end of the table. He refused to acknowledge the old mechanic sitting in the shadows. Campbell did not hesitate. He spoke the final devastating truth into the quiet room. He informed Trevor that the surviving co-founder of the $250 million logistics empire was sitting right in front of him. Because I was the surviving co-founder, 100% of the estate reverted entirely to me. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. Trevor stared at the lawyer, his mouth slightly open, his breath caught in his throat. He slowly turned his head to look down the long expanse of mahogany. He looked at my ruined shoes. He looked at my damp, wrinkled jacket. He looked at the deep calluses on my hands resting quietly on the table. The reality of his situation crashed into him with the force of a freight train. The corporate collateral he had used to secure the $15 million loan from the Shadow Syndicate was completely non-existent. He had pledged an empire that belonged entirely to the man he had just threatened to lock in an asylum. He had handed a fraudulent lien to a cartel of violent predators, and now he had absolutely no way to pay them back. His offshore transfer was federally frozen, and his inheritance was legally annihilated. Monica dropped her porcelain cup. The delicate saucer clattered against the wood, spilling dark espresso across the pristine table. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that her lavish lifestyle had just evaporated into thin air. She realized she was married to a man who possessed nothing but a catastrophic debt to very dangerous people. Trevor tried to speak, but no words came out. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, as panic finally flooded his nervous system. The illusion of his power was shattered, leaving nothing behind but the terrifying reality of his own hubris. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of gloating or victory. I simply sat at the end of the table watching the natural order of the world restore itself. The wolves were waiting at the door, and my son had just realized he had locked himself outside in the dark. Trevor stared at the lawyer as the devastating words settled into the quiet, sterile air of the executive boardroom. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face just moments ago completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a hollow, terrified blankness as the blood rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin the color of pale chalk. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a high ledge and was desperately waiting to hit the concrete ground. Monica sat frozen beside him, her breathing shallow and rapid, her dark eyes darting back and forth between her trembling husband and the impassive lawyer. She could sense the catastrophic shift in the room, even if she did not fully understand the complex legal mechanisms at play. She knew enough about power to recognize when it had evaporated. Trevor suddenly lurched forward. He slammed his manicured palms flat against the polished mahogany table and pushed himself violently up from his heavy leather chair. The expensive chair rolled backward and crashed loudly into the glass wall behind him, but he did not seem to notice the sound. He stood towering over the table, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking finger at Campbell. He yelled that the lawyer was lying through his teeth. He screamed that the Joint Survivorship Trust was an absolute fabrication, a desperate last-minute forgery designed to steal his rightful billionaire inheritance. His voice cracked, echoing harshly off the high ceilings as he turned his furious, panicked gaze toward me. He spat that I was nothing but a broke mechanic living in a dusty garage smelling of motor oil and failure. He yelled that I did not possess the intellect, the education, or the ambition to build a $250 million tech empire. He demanded that Campbell stop playing games and hand over the real documents immediately before he fired everyone in the building. Campbell did not flinch at the violent outburst. He maintained the calm, detached demeanor of a man who had navigated 1,000 corporate meltdowns and witnessed the ruin of far greater men than Trevor. He simply reached back into his leather portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of heavy yellowed paper. It was not a modern digital printout or a freshly drafted legal addendum. It was an original physical document preserved meticulously for over 3 decades. Campbell placed the old paper flat on the table and gently pushed it forward. The document slid smoothly across the polished mahogany surface, coming to a stop directly beneath Trevor, shaking hands. Campbell instructed him to look closely at the signatures at the bottom of the page. He explained that this was the original founding corporate charter of the logistics network, drafted and notarized long before the company had even acquired its first server or rented its first office space. Trevor looked down at the faded parchment. The bright ambient light of the boardroom illuminated the stark black ink. He saw his mother's signature, elegant and sweeping, taking up the left side of the page. And right beside it, he saw my signature, sharp, precise, and undeniable. Campbell explained that Caroline had always been the charismatic public visionary, but I was the singular silent architect of the entire digital infrastructure. I had written the proprietary routing algorithms that made the company billions. I had designed the automated compliance protocols from a damp workbench. I had built the massive digital fortress that Trevor was now trying to casually loot. Campbell stated that the highly publicized divorce had been a calculated legal shield designed specifically to protect my ownership stake from predatory corporate lawsuits. The grease-stained mechanic disguise was a deliberate illusion meant to keep the true power of the company safely hidden in the shadows while Caroline managed the public-facing board of directors. Trevor stared at my signature on the 30-year-old charter. His eyes widened as the devastating reality of his entire existence washed over him. He realized that his mother had never respected his business acumen. She had simply allowed him to play dress-up in the corporate offices, wearing expensive suits, while the real architect watched and judged him from afar. The empire he thought he had conquered was a living machine I had built with my own 2 hands, and he had just walked willingly into its grinding gears. The silence in the boardroom was heavy and suffocating. Trevor slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair, his legs trembling, unable to support his weight any longer. Monica pulled her hand away from his arm as if he were suddenly diseased. She saw the absolute ruin written across his pale face, and she knew their lavish lifestyle was officially dead. She shifted her chair away from him, distancing herself from the collateral damage. I looked down the immense length of the table and finally broke my silence. My voice was calm, flat, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. It carried the cold weight of absolute certainty. I told my son that his mother had spent the last 2 years watching him rot from the inside out. I explained that we had both witnessed his blinding greed and his pathetic attempts to manipulate the board of directors into giving him more power. I told him we knew he viewed us as expendable resources, and we knew he would try to seize the company the moment she died. I brought up the floor safe in my dusty garage. I told him I knew he had drilled the lock while I was supposedly sleeping. I told him I knew all about the corrupt clinic and his cowardly plan to finalize a forced medical conservatorship to lock me in a state asylum. Trevor swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat running down the side of his face. He tried to speak to formulate some kind of arrogant defense, but his throat was completely dry. I reached into the inner pocket of my damp, wrinkled jacket and pulled out a single sheet of standard printer paper. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing out the deep creases, and slid it across the long table toward him. I told him to look at the routing numbers printed on the page. I watched as his terrified eyes scanned the cascading data. It was a direct copy of the Federal freeze sequence I had initiated from the master terminal the night before. I told him I knew everything about the shadow lenders. I explained that I had tracked his fraudulent $15 million wire transfer through his pathetic amateur maze of offshore shell companies. I watched the last remaining spark of defiant arrogance die in his eyes as I told him I had triggered the automated compliance protocols and locked his money in a permanent federal void. I explained that the capital was trapped between international borders and would never reach the syndicate bank accounts. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany table. My voice dropped to a low, icy whisper that echoed through the quiet boardroom. I stated that he had leveraged property that belonged entirely to me. I explained that pledging a massive corporate empire he did not own to secure a $15 million shadow loan was the textbook definition of felony wire fraud. I told him the federal authorities were already auditing the offshore accounts and building a massive, airtight criminal case against him. I promised him that the Financial Crimes Division would be tearing his life apart by the end of the week. But I also told him the federal government was the least of his immediate problems. I explained that the violent syndicate he had tried to cheat was no longer waiting patiently for their return on investment. I told him I had personally acquired a burner phone and called their restricted line to inform them that his collateral was a complete ghost. I let that dark reality sink deep into his bones. I told him the wolves were already at the door, and they knew exactly who had stolen their money. He had built his entire identity on the grand illusion of infinite power, and now that illusion had completely shattered, leaving him isolated and defenseless. I sat back in my wooden chair, folding my hands together, and watched my son stare blindly into the dark, terrifying abyss of his own making. The crushing weight of absolute reality finally settled over the cavernous boardroom, extinguishing the last remnants of my son's grand illusion. Monica stared at the man she had married just 3 years ago in a lavish ceremony funded entirely by my silent company. The glittering image of the billionaire tech heir had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified hollow shell of a man drowning in a $15 million criminal debt. She did not scream or throw a theatrical tantrum. She was a creature of absolute financial pragmatism, a predator in her own right, and she understood the cold mathematics of survival better than anyone else in the room. Her dark eyes darted from the vintage corporate charter sitting on Campbell's desk to the stark federal freeze document I had presented. She performed a rapid, ruthless mental calculation, processing the exact trajectory of the fallout. Being married to a wealthy heir was a highly profitable business transaction, but being legally tethered to a man facing imminent federal wire fraud charges and violent syndicate retaliation was a definitive death sentence. She stood up from her plush leather chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, and perfectly composed. She reached across with her right hand and grasped the massive diamond engagement ring and the heavy platinum wedding band on her left hand. She twisted the cold metal, pulling the expensive rings over her knuckle in one fluid, practiced motion. She held the jewelry suspended over the dark mahogany wood for only a fraction of a second before letting go. The heavy rings dropped onto the polished surface with a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed violently in the silent room. She did not look at Trevor. She did not offer a single word of comfort, a tear or an explanation. She simply turned her back on the wreckage of her marriage and walked toward the heavy double doors at the far end of the room. The rhythmic, authoritative click of her expensive designer heels against the hardwood floor sounded like a metronome counting down the final seconds of my son life. She pushed the mahogany doors open and vanished into the corridor, severing their entire existence together without a single backward glance. Trevor watched her leave, completely paralyzed by the sudden, absolute nature of his abandonment. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged from his dry throat. The pristine, silver-tailored suit he wore now looked absurd, like a cheap costume draped over a frightened child. He looked down at the glittering diamond rings resting abandoned on the dark wood. The reality of his complete isolation began to suffocate him. The air in the boardroom suddenly felt too thin. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he frantically patted the pockets of his jacket. He pulled out his sleek smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently that the device nearly slipped from his grasp, clattering against his palm. He swiped across the screen, leaving streaks of cold sweat across the smooth glass. He was desperately searching for a lifeline, for a legal loophole, for a single contact in his vast network of shallow friends who could bail him out of a $15 million abyss. But the digital world offered no salvation. The screen suddenly lit up with an incoming text message. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, watching the exact moment his heart stopped beating. The notification chime pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom, ringing out like a funeral bell. Trevor stared at the glowing text, his eyes widening in absolute primal terror. He let out a low, guttural sound that resembled a wounded animal caught in a steel trap. The burner phone I had discarded in the storm drain the night before had done its job flawlessly. The Shadow Syndicate did not rely on corporate lawyers or federal courts to collect their massive debts. They operated strictly on violence, fear, and immediate physical consequence. The text message was brief and horrifyingly clear. They told him they were standing in the marble lobby downstairs. They told him the exits were completely covered, and they were waiting patiently for him to step out of the private elevator. The wolves had officially arrived. Trevor dropped the phone onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and bumped gently against his discarded wedding rings, illuminating them with its pale, artificial light. He staggered backward, stumbling clumsily over the wheeled legs of his plush leather chair. His knees buckled under the crushing, suffocating weight of his terror. He collapsed onto the thick, woven carpet, the sharp impact sending a dull tremor through the floorboards. The arrogant, sneering heir, who had casually slid an asylum brochure across the table only minutes ago, was entirely gone. The man who had mocked my damp clothes and threatened to erase my existence was reduced to a weeping, trembling mess on the floor. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging himself across the expensive rug toward my end of the table. He did not care about his pride, his dignity, or his bespoke suit rubbing against the floor. He was begging for his life. He stopped a few feet away from my chair, looking up at me with red, bloodshot eyes. Tears streamed down his pale cheeks, mixing with the cold sweat of absolute panic. He raised his shaking hands, pressing his palms together in an act of desperate, pathetic supplication. He sobbed uncontrollably, the sound echoing miserably in the massive executive suite. He begged me to cancel the federal freeze. He pleaded with me to access the master terminal, immediately release the $15 million, and push the wire transfer through to the offshore accounts before the syndicate enforcers came upstairs. He promised he would sign away every single right he had to the estate. He swore he would relinquish the $20 bequest pack, his bags disappear into exile, and never ask for another dime as long as he lived. He just needed the capital to pay the violent men waiting in the lobby. He cried that they were going to kill him, that they were going to drag him out of the building by his hair and execute him in a dark alleyway. He reminded me that I had built this empire from nothing, and that $15 million was just a microscopic fraction of the company total valuation. He begged me to view the money as a ransom, a necessary business expense to save a human life. He sobbed that I could not simply sit there in silence and let a ruthless cartel murder him over a financial error. He scrambled closer, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table to pull his trembling body up slightly. He looked at me with a pathetic, shattered expression and played the absolute last card he had left in his hand. He cried out that he was my son. He begged me to remember the boy I had raised in that small suburban house. He pleaded with me to remember teaching him how to ride a bicycle and building his first computer in the damp garage. He begged me to look past his monumental mistakes and save his life, because a father is supposed to protect his child from the monsters of the world no matter what. I listened to his sobbing, desperate pleas without moving a single muscle. The heavy emotional words washed over me like freezing rain hitting solid, unyielding stone. I looked down at the man groveling on the floor. I did not see the little boy who used to hand me wrenches in the garage. I did not see the innocent child who used to sit at the kitchen table and dream of building a future. That boy had died a very long time ago, consumed by an insatiable, toxic hunger for social status and unearned wealth. The creature crying at my feet was a ruthless parasite that had willingly invited violent criminals into my legacy. He had forged his mother's signature mere days after her death. He had placed a fraudulent, massive lien on the sweat and blood of thousands of honest, hard-working employees. He had mocked my intelligence, threatened to demolish my home, and actively plotted to strip away my basic human rights by locking me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. He did not feel an ounce of genuine remorse for his terrible actions. He was only crying because he had been caught in his own trap and the brutal physical consequences had finally arrived to collect their due. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and absolute, broken only by Trevor, ragged, desperate sobbing, and the faint hum of the climate control system. Campbell stood quietly near the oak podium, his face completely impassive, observing the natural resolution of a threat that had lingered over the company for years. The corporate lawyers, the board members, and the public relations teams had always worried about how to handle Trevor's erratic, destructive behavior. They had spent millions trying to mitigate his damage. But corruption cannot be mitigated or managed. It must be excised, entirely cut out at the root, before it poisons the entire healthy organism. By allowing Trevor to execute his own fraudulent scheme and then trapping him within his own illegal framework, I had removed the infection without compromising the integrity of the empire. I watched him bury his face in his hands, weeping bitterly into the carpet. He had built a fortress of arrogance and deception, and now he was begging me to shield him from the falling debris. I looked down at the pathetic figure sobbing onto the expensive hand-woven carpet. Trevor was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was begging for salvation. He was asking me to magically erase the catastrophic mess he had willingly created. He wanted me to open the federal freeze, to hand $15 million to a cartel of violent predators, and to pretend that none of this had ever happened. He was weeping like a terrified child, asking his father to chase away the monsters hiding under the bed. But these monsters were real, and Trevor had personally invited them into our home. The air in the boardroom was thick and heavy. Campbell stood silently near the oak podium, watching the complete unraveling of the man who had strutted into the room just 30 minutes earlier. I kept my hands folded together on the smooth surface of the table. I did not lean forward to comfort him. I did not offer a single word of reassurance. I let him cry. I let the absolute terror of his reality sink deep into his bones. Trevor choked on his tears, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. He repeated that he was my son. He repeated that I had to save him. He told me that $15 million was nothing compared to the $250 million valuation of the company. He swore he would disappear and never bother me again if I just paid off the men waiting in the lobby. He claimed that a father was supposed to protect his family, no matter what crimes they had committed. I felt my jaw tighten. My voice was low and completely steady when I finally spoke. I asked him if he remembered where we were exactly 24 hours ago. Trevor blinked, his face contorted in panic and confusion. He shook his head frantically, unable to focus on anything beyond his own immediate survival. I did not wait for him to answer. I painted the picture for him with absolute precision. I reminded him that just yesterday morning, we were standing in the grand foyer of the family estate. I reminded him how he had pushed me hard against the wall, his breath reeking of expensive scotch. I recalled exactly how he had smiled when he told me I was a senile burden. He had held a glossy brochure for a state-run psychiatric ward in his hand, and he had promised to lock me in a padded room for the rest of my natural life. He had told me he was going to erase my existence simply because I was in the way of his greed. Trevor opened his mouth to make an excuse to claim he did not mean it, to blame the alcohol or the stress. I raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. I told him that 24 hours ago he was willing to strip away my basic human rights to steal an empire he did not build. He was entirely willing to let me die alone in a sterile medical facility, surrounded by strangers, simply so he could fund his lavish lifestyle and hide his gambling debts from his wife. I told him that a son does not orchestrate the mental destruction of his father. A son does not forge legal documents or use the family legacy as collateral for illicit shadow loans. I told him he had forfeited the right to call me his family the moment he decided I was nothing but disposable property. Trevor let out a loud, agonizing wail. He dropped his head back onto the carpet, weeping hysterically. He cried that they were going to kill him. He sobbed that the syndicate enforcers in the lobby would put a bullet in his head the moment he stepped off the elevator. He begged me to show mercy. I looked at the center of the massive mahogany table. Sitting directly in the middle of the polished wood next to the spilled espresso and Monica discarded wedding rings was a crisp $20 bill. Campbell had placed it there during the reading of the preamble to fulfill the strict legal requirement of Carolyn's final will and testament. It was the only thing Trevor was legally entitled to inherit. It was the absolute measure of his worth. I pointed a steady finger at the small piece of green paper. I told Trevor to look at the table. He slowly lifted his tear-stained face following the direction of my hand. I told him that the $20 bill was his inheritance. I told him it was his severance package and his total accumulated wealth. I stated with absolute finality that the $20 was the only financial bailout he was ever going to receive from me or from this company. Trevor stared at the money. His breathing became erratic and shallow. He shook his head violently, refusing to accept the reality of my words. He screamed that $20 could not save him. He yelled that he needed $15 million to survive the afternoon. He clawed at the carpet, trying to drag himself closer to my chair, begging me to stop playing a cruel game. He cried that the men downstairs were monsters, and they would tear him apart if he walked out of this building empty-handed. I looked him directly in the eyes. My voice dropped to an icy whisper that echoed clearly off the glass walls of the boardroom. I told him he should have thought about the monsters before he decided to steal $15 million. I told him he had made a high-stakes gamble with his life, and he had lost everything. The time for parental protection had officially expired. He was a grown man, and today he was going to face the severe and uncompromising consequences of his own actions. Trevor realized I was not going to break. He realized the vault was permanently sealed, and his father was entirely immune to his tears. His profound sadness instantly mutated back into desperate, cornered rage. He lunged upward, trying to grab the lapels of my suit, screaming that I was murdering him. He yelled that his blood would be on my hands. He cursed my name and cursed his mother for leaving him with nothing. I did not flinch. I did not move away. Before Trevor could even close the distance, Campbell reached over and pressed a small silver button on the oak podium. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the boardroom violently swung open. 4 massive private security guards stepped into the room. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, moving with silent military precision. They marched directly down the length of the long table, bypassing the spilled coffee and the empty chairs. Trevor turned to look at them, his eyes widening in pure horror. He tried to scramble backward, but his legs were tangled in his ruined silver suit. The two lead guards grabbed Trevor by the shoulders. They hauled him up from the carpet with effortless, brutal efficiency. Trevor thrashed wildly, kicking his expensive shoes against the polished wood of the table and screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded that they unhand him. He shrieked that he was the chief executive officer of the company. He yelled that he owned the building and he would have them all arrested for assault. The guards did not speak a single word. They simply locked their massive hands around his arms and began to drag him backward toward the open double doors. Trevor dug his heels into the thick carpet, fighting with the desperate, frantic energy of a man being dragged to the gallows. He looked over his shoulder, screaming my name. He begged me to call them off. He pleaded with me to give him one more chance to let him stay in the boardroom and hide from the lobby. His voice cracked, tearing at his throat as he sobbed for mercy. I remained seated at the end of the table. I watched the security team drag my flesh and blood across the room. I felt the heavy weight of 40 years of fatherhood pressing down on my chest, but my resolve did not waver. I had to let him go. I had to release the infection to save the empire. I told Trevor that the authorities were waiting for him. I reminded him that the Federal Financial Crimes Division wanted to discuss his fraudulent wire transfers, and the Shadow Syndicate wanted to discuss their missing $15 million. I told him he had a very busy afternoon ahead of him, and it was time to leave my building. The guards dragged Trevor through the threshold of the boardroom. His fingers clawed desperately at the heavy wooden doorframe, leaving pale scratches against the dark varnish. He let out one final agonizing scream, begging me to save his life. The sound echoed down the long, pristine hallway of the executive suite. The two remaining security guards stepped backward out of the room and firmly grabbed the brass handles. They pulled the massive mahogany doors shut with a heavy, definitive thud. The lock engaged, sealing the boardroom in absolute quiet. The screaming was instantly cut off. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. I sat alone at the long table with Campbell. The air still smelled of spilled espresso and Trevor expensive cologne. I looked down at the crisp $20 bill resting on the wood. It was over. The empire was secure. The parasite had been excised. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, letting the reality of the empty room wash over me. Down below in the marble lobby, the real world was finally introducing itself to my son. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, and the sound of my son's screaming faded into the thick, carpeted walls of the executive corridor. The silence that rushed into the massive boardroom was absolute and profound. It was the kind of deep quiet that follows a violent thunderstorm when the wind finally dies down and the heavy rain stops falling. I sat in my wooden chair at the far end of the sprawling, polished table and listened to the emptiness of the room. There was no sense of triumph in my chest. There was no sudden rush of vindication or sadistic joy at watching Trevor lose everything he had ever valued. There was only the heavy, exhausting weight of a necessary tragedy. The natural order of the universe had been violently disrupted by blinding greed, and I had simply allowed the scales to balance themselves once again. Campbell stood quietly near the oak podium, packing his thick ivory documents back into his imported leather portfolio. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who understood the profound gravity of what had just transpired. We were the only two people left in the cavernous space. The spilled espresso was slowly soaking into the pristine wood of the table next to the discarded diamond rings Monica had left behind. They were nothing but glittering pieces of cold metal, completely stripped of their meaning and value. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My knees ached and the damp fabric of my worn jacket felt stiff against my shoulders, but my mind was completely clear. I walked slowly across the room, toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that dominated the far wall. The sprawling city stretched out below us, a vast ocean of concrete and steel bathed in the pale morning light. The freezing rain from the night before had finally stopped, leaving the streets washed clean and shimmering. I looked down at the tiny cars moving along the gray asphalt and the endless rows of buildings stretching toward the horizon. This was the empire Caroline and I had built together. We had started in a freezing suburban garage with nothing but a second-hand computer and a brilliant idea. We had spent decades writing code and building routing algorithms while the rest of the world slept. We never cared about the glass towers or the luxury cars or the endless corporate banquets. We only cared about the work and the quiet satisfaction of creating something out of nothing. Trevor had never understood that philosophy. He looked at the city and only saw things he could buy and people he could control. He had mistaken the shallow trappings of wealth for actual power, and that mistake had ultimately destroyed him. I placed my calloused hand against the cool glass and took a long, deep breath. The suffocating tension that had gripped my chest for the past 2 years finally began to dissolve. The long nightmare of watching my own flesh and blood turn into a ruthless parasite was definitively over. I turned away from the window and looked back at the lawyer. Campbell had finished clasping his portfolio and was waiting patiently for my final instructions. I walked back toward the table and told him we still had a few loose ends to tie up before the day was over. My voice was calm and steady, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had reclaimed his life. I instructed Campbell to contact the city courthouse immediately and intercept the fraudulent medical conservatorship order Trevor had filed. I told him to deploy the full weight of our legal division to completely dismantle the fake psychiatric evaluation and ensure the corrupt clinic was permanently shut down by federal regulators. I wanted every single doctor who had signed their name to that fraudulent document to face immediate criminal prosecution. Campbell nodded sharply, recording the directive in his mind with absolute precision. I then reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled pawn shop receipt. I placed it gently on the edge of the mahogany table. I told Campbell that 24 hours ago my son had frozen my bank accounts and forced me onto the freezing streets with absolutely nothing. I explained that I had been forced to pawn the simple gold wedding band Caroline had given me 40 years ago just to secure a burner phone and a safe place to sleep. The memory of pulling that ring off my freezing finger in the pouring rain was a fresh and painful wound. I asked the lawyer to send someone down to the pawn shop in the garment district to retrieve the ring. I told him it was the only piece of jewelry I had ever cared about, and I wanted it back on my hand before the sun went down. Campbell picked up the small slip of paper and placed it carefully into his jacket pocket. He asked me how I wished to proceed with the logistics holding company and the $250 million liquid estate that had just reverted to my sole ownership. I looked down the length of the empty boardroom table and thought about Caroline. I remembered the long, quiet conversations we used to have late at night, discussing what to do with the massive fortune we had accidentally accumulated. We had both known that handing the empire to Trevor would only accelerate his moral decay. We had devised a final masterstroke to ensure the money served a purpose far greater than fueling the arrogant lifestyle of an entitled heir. I looked directly at Campbell and told him to initiate the final phase of Carolyn True Wish. I instructed him to dissolve the corporate holding company and liquidate the vast majority of the commercial assets. I ordered him to transfer the bulk of the $250 million estate into the philanthropic foundation Caroline and I had secretly established 5 years ago. It was a private trust dedicated entirely to funding education and providing shelter for at-risk youth across the city. I wanted the money to go to young people who actually knew the value of hard work and survival. I wanted it to build trade schools and engineering programs for teenagers who were currently building their own futures in damp garages just like I had. I wanted to give them the exact same chance that Carolyn and I had created for ourselves. It was the ultimate silent reckoning. The fortune Trevor had lied and stolen to control would now be used to save the lives of thousands of desperate children while he faced federal prison entirely alone. The irony was perfect and absolute. Campbell offered a rare, genuine smile, acknowledging the brilliant justice of the final directive. He assured me that the paperwork was already drafted, and the transfer of funds to the foundation would begin before the banks closed this afternoon. The natural order of the world had been perfectly restored. The fortune was safe, the parasite was excised, and the legacy Caroline and I built was finally completely secure. I stood in the center of the silent boardroom and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my tired body. The anger and the sorrow that had clouded my mind for months were entirely washed away, leaving nothing but quiet clarity. I reached down and slowly buttoned my worn, damp jacket. I looked at the frayed cuffs and the grease stains on my sleeves. I was a mechanic standing in the center of a billionaire penthouse suite, but I had never felt more powerful or more comfortable in my own skin. I did not need a silver suit or a luxury briefcase to validate my existence. I possessed the undeniable strength of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. I turned and walked toward the heavy double doors at the far end of the room. My footsteps were steady and deliberate, sinking into the thick, woven carpet. I did not look back at the discarded glossy brochure for the asylum or the spilled coffee on the table. I walked out of the boardroom and stepped into the quiet hallway, heading toward the elevators. I was leaving the corporate tower not as a broken victim of family betrayal, but as the quiet, undisputed architect of my own destiny. The illusion of power built on greed and deception will inevitably crumble when confronted with quiet truth and infinite patience. People who view their family merely as a disposable financial resource ultimately orchestrate their own absolute destruction. True strength is not found in screaming arrogance or flashy displays of unearned wealth, but in the quiet, meticulous preparation of a justified defense. When you treat the people who built your foundation with profound cruelty, you actively dismantle the very ground beneath your own feet. Justice does not always require anger, it only requires the immutable restoration of the natural order. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic life lessons.